Okay, so the final theme for the topic is the fourth changing quality of life. So the first part of the theme is basically this question of living standards. So in theme 4, there's three sub-themes. There's standard of living, popular culture, and then finally tourism and transport. So the first one is basically changing living standards. And just before I start going into the topic itself, I just want to start off by going over this issue of criteria of how you judge or measure quality of life. This is a topic, as I'm going to mention on the next slide, is one which is naturally quite a synoptic topic, and there are several areas I'm going to focus on in this lecture that are unique to this particular topic. However, when you get any kind of question about standard of living, there are certain points we've already considered at some point in the rest of the course, or other particular points which I'm not covered here, that can still be potentially relevant. Standard of living is quite a broad idea, and so if you get any question about standard of living, unless it specifies something in particular, generally speaking there are a range of different ways you can judge living standards or how far living standards have changed. So just to give you a few examples of things that come to mind, there are others as well. Some of those you can judge standard of living are by looking at things like public health or healthcare. By looking at people's spending power is a really obvious one. Housing conditions or conditions of like issues of homelessness, etc. Again, some of these things are interlinked. Issues like people's diet or widespread issues of hunger. Employment obviously comes into living standards. You obviously haven't got a very high standard of living if you haven't got a job. Also, you think about things like conveniences. There are other items or issues that you can also potentially discuss when it comes to quality of life, but I think those are the more common criteria you can use to measure quality of life. That's the first thing. The second thing, as I already mentioned, is this issue of synopticity. So this is a course which by now you should have realised is quite synoptic. Very often, if you get a question which you think is from a particular theme, you can address content or topics you've learned in other themes to help you with those questions. This is most often the case for topics from, I think, from theme 4. I think more than any other topic, there's a really wide range of relevant points you can discuss for various questions that have come from different topics. So, for example, with changing living standards, I would say, generally speaking, most, if not all, content from the other theme 4 sub-themes tends to be quite relevant here, in particular 4C. 4C is very relevant to 4A, but it just has its own separate theme, but you can mention it in the question of living standards. Additionally, the welfare state. Some of the topics, some of the issues I'm going to mention here overlap quite a bit with content we looked at when we looked at the welfare state. So the welfare state in particular tends to be very relevant and is quite decent fertile ground for discussing living standards, and so that's always worth being aware about. There are also a range of other points from different sub-themes that can also be brought up. That's just the key thing, just to even as a starting point. There are a few points you can pick up and come across the course. Okay, so as always, I'm going to start off by looking at the interwar period and discussing living standards or changing standards of living in the interwar period, so from about 1839. I'll then briefly look at what changes in the war and then what happens after the Second World War. So, a brief overall summary of the interwar time period when it comes to living standards. Immediately after the war comes to an end, there's a fall in living standards for a large number of people because of the economic crisis that hits after this very short-lived post-war boom. I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is in particular the standard of living for a lot of soldiers who come back from the war. Their standard of living drops quite quickly. The really big point that I'm going to pick up on quite a bit is this issue of regional variation, which you should hopefully remember from last year when we covered it. It's very difficult to talk about a uniform change in the standard of living across the country in the interwar period, because you've got essentially a tale of two countries in this time period, in particular in the Depression. So you've got a decline in standard of living in the old industrial heartlands, whereas actually there's an argument that in the areas of newer industry, lighter industries, you've got rising standards of living. Similarly, in those places that suffer quite a bit, you get, in addition to unemployment that comes about, issues with hunger and poor diet affecting those areas. Finally, the final point I'm going to mention is about real incomes. If you do take a uniform look at the country as a whole, you can say that actually real incomes, which I'll come back to and explain later, rise on the whole during this time period across the country. But that's without counting the regional variation. Alright, so we'll start off with this post-war boom. So, very briefly, and again, you might remember this point when we mentioned it when we looked at the economy. Immediately after the First World War, there is a boom in the economy. That's essentially because during the First World War, there's been no trading because the Germans have been bombing ships all over the place. Suddenly, when the war's over, people are able to trade a lot more freely, and there is in the immediate aftermath a boom in international trade as a result. That situation, however, is pretty short-lived, and economic crisis ensues very shortly after this. And so you find that by the end of 1920, a lot of the soldiers who returned home from the war are facing quite dire economic circumstances, and their standard of living has actually dropped quite a lot. So unemployment has actually risen to about 1 million, and the estimates say about 1/3 of all ex-soldiers were unemployed after the war came to an end. And so for many ex-soldiers across the country, living standards fall quite sharply. So it's often said that it was very common to see beggars in the street, basically having beggars with medals from the war for their service, which is meant to be indicative of the fact that loads of ex-soldiers struggled after the war. And that's the point that I'll come back to when we look at housing after the Second World War. So that's the first point. But I would say that in general though, if you ever got a question about living standards, that I think is one which is quite a small point. So if you had a range of other more developed points, there would be better points to kind of roll with for kind of a paragraph in an exam. Because I think that can generally be a bit tricky to develop into its own quite significant point. The really major story of falling living standards though in the interwar period is the fall in living standards in the areas of old heavy industry, or the old heavy industrial heartlands. In particular, there are serious issues over overemployment. So again, when we looked at the economy, we've already been over this issue where the old staple industries, things like shipbuilding, coal mining, steel, etc., due to kind of increased competition, those industries struggle quite significantly due to the kind of international competition they're facing. As a result, that to kind of try and increase their sort of profits or kind of deal with that kind of increased competition, the net result is often for these employers to basically cut the wages of the guys who are working there, increase working hours, and most controversially, lay off lots of workers. So unemployment tends to be most severe in these areas of old heavy industry. During the Depression, at some points, you've got in some areas, essentially the majority of them are unemployed. So for example, in shipbuilding, 70% of people are unemployed. And so if you look at the areas where these industries are significant, are quite important, it's in areas like sort of Wales, parts of South Wales, the north. The situation with employment is significantly worse than it is, for example, the southeast in London. As I said, this is a situation which is already the case in the 20s, given the struggles that exist in industries like mining. In the 30s, when the Depression sets in, and again, global trade takes a hit, and these industries start struggling even more, you get an even greater number of long-term unemployed workers. So when we say long-term unemployed, these are people who are literally unemployed for years on end, as opposed to just temporarily losing their work. And so, with unemployment also comes a range of other issues. So in these same areas we're talking about, you also have issues related to hunger and poor diet. But when we say poor diet, some of these points are actually quite difficult to imagine. When you think of like sort of modern conveniences and the kind of vast range of foods you're able to access, with sort of like modern supermarkets, it's really difficult to imagine just like how people get by this way. But essentially, things like finding meat, fresh vegetables, forget about it. You'll have large numbers of families who basically do not have access to these foods, and as a result, will get, as you'd imagine, the range of quite serious deficiency diseases that will come along with having a diet, which basically comprises of bread, margarine, and tea. So you get things like rickets, etc. And so people's health, as a result of their poor diet, also takes a significant hit. at times, people might not even be able to access those basic foods in the first place, and so very often you've also got lack of food in the first place. In these instances, it's women in particular that are often the most adversely affected. I'll just take a point, I just wanted to point out right here, with this question of living standards, I'm not going to go into women in much detail, however, you could, for another way of developing this point more, is not just discussing things regionally, you could also discuss living standards of women, for example. And so if you look back at the topic and the lecture on women, a lot of these issues are discussed in more depth. So you could, for example, bring in that point about women having quite poor living standards and link it into some of the issues that we discussed in that, so with regards to their economic condition, lack of employment, lack of education, etc. However, on this particular point, so in these areas, in these sort of depressed areas, what tends to happen is, if there's not enough food to go around, is basically the women in the family who basically eat last or go hungry if necessary. So that kind of the man who's the breadwinner can eat, so the children can eat as well. Additionally, in these areas as well, you get an increasing number of people whose money is diverted primarily towards food and little else, and so you very rarely have, for example, money left over to spend on even, again, quite basic essentials like clothes, for example. And even things like food are often paid through via borrowing, so people often get by what we call TIC, which is essentially your really informal borrowing agreement with the local shopkeeper. So you know the person, you have like an agreement, you've taken X, Y, Z, you'll pay them back later. So this isn't like formal borrowing, it's kind of like on a day-to-day basis, people are having to get by informally on their local relationship with the shopkeeper. So again, it kind of links into these issues of unemployment, depression in these heartlands, but it's got further knock-on effects on their standards of living as a result. So this is the story when it comes to depression in most parts of the countries, in particular these old areas of heavy industry. However, it's quite difficult to sustain the argument that the entire country goes into depression, because it doesn't. As I said, this is something which is mainly restricted to the areas of old heavy industry. By contrast, regions that are based around areas of newer light industry that are cropping up, in particular around the southeast and London, these areas tend to do a lot better. I've not put on PowerPoint, but just kind of one of the basic reasons why that tends to be the case is because a lot of these old industrial regions rely upon international trade. So when you're doing things like shipbuilding, steel, etc., those businesses survive is often via international trade. And so when there's a downturn in international trade, you subsequently suffer. When we say lighter industry, just to be clear, we mean a lot of industries that tend to essentially be modern conveniences, small electricals, lighting, refrigeration, things like that. These are industries that tend to essentially be consumer goods and for a consumer market. So whatever might be happening abroad when it comes to international trade, you will still have a domestic market to sell these items to. So these types of industries, so we call them light industries, and these are all newer industries as well, they tend to still do quite well, because if the Japanese can't buy off you, it doesn't make a difference. You're not selling lights to them in the first place. So these industries tend to grow up or crop up around London and the southeast in particular. And so in these areas, people actually do quite well. So even in the 1930s when the Depression hit, employment actually remains quite high in these areas. So for example, if we take electrical appliances as an industry, you only have 12% unemployed. It's still a relatively high number, but it's nothing compared to the kind of the 70% you see in sort of parts of Glasgow and shipbuilding and areas like that. And so what you also then get as a result, in the 1930s, you get a consumer boom in these areas. So people increasingly begin to buy things like household electrical appliances. In addition, that's also because in this part of the southeast, a lot of the newer housing is for the first time electrified, in other words, have access to electricity. So people in these areas are increasingly able to purchase a lot of, again, these sort of light goods, consumer products, like sort of early labour-saving devices. It's not massively widespread, but it's beginning to increase for the first time. So A, people have access to those goods in parts of the southeast, but in addition, it also means that those industries do well. People who work in them also do well. So the southeast, you can argue in the 1930s there was no depression there at all. So leaving aside the regional picture for a moment as well, the final point that people often make as a major reason or a major way of arguing that living standards actually improved in the interwar period is by looking at this question of real incomes. So, if you guys recall from last year, when we talk about real incomes, we basically mean somebody's income as it compares to inflation. So, if people's incomes are rising faster than the cost of living, or if the cost of living is decreasing, then your real income as a result increases because you can purchase, your purchasing power as a result is stronger. So, while wages did fall for the poorest in society in the interwar period, real incomes rose for most people across the country. And the reason behind that isn't because their actual wages rose by so much, but it's because the cost of living itself declined significantly. So they said that the cost of living fell by more than a third, roughly speaking, between 1920 and 1938. Food in particular fell a lot faster than people's wages. And so as a result, people's real incomes rose. The final reason why people's real incomes again also rose, and this also has some link to the women topic when we looked at contraception, which is that, again, if you've done your women revision recently, you'll know that contraception begins to become more prevalent in the interwar period. It's not very, very widespread, but from around sort of 1930 onwards, it becomes, there's increasing access to various early forms of contraception. And so what you get as a result of that is a shrinking of the average family size by almost a half in the interwar period. So again, naturally, people's cost of living drops significantly because they have fewer people for their wages to divide between, and so as a result, their living standards increase once again. And then the final point, again, if you've done your welfare revision fairly recently, then this is a point which we've already mentioned again in that topic briefly. There is an argument also to be made that the housing situation improved the standard of living for many people as well in the interwar period. I'm not going to go into more detail than this. If you want to get more, have a look at that that welfare, that 2A welfare one as a refresher. But essentially, you do get better quality of housing cropping up for the first time, or not for the first time, but cropping up in the interwar period. More and more people begin to move from these very overcrowded inner city slums to a lot of these newer suburbs that are starting to be built in the interwar period. Slum clearance does increase quite a bit around sort of 1931. Additionally though, you also get an increase in home ownership due to some of the cheaper prices of some homes in particular. So again, a lot of this newer housing that's being built outside of London, or small properties, often cost only a few £100s. Older houses can be even cheaper than this. So I think this is a stat I'll mention when I do the 4C topic when we look at the cost of cars. Some older houses will basically cost you less than the cost of a brand new car, like a small family car. So housing is often, is generally speaking, becoming quite cheaper, or becoming cheaper for most people, and so it's becoming more affordable. It doesn't significantly improve, but there is some improvement. But again, there's more on that in the 2A topic. Okay, so that takes us through to the end of the interwar period. When it comes to the, again, as I mentioned for a lot of these previous topics, when it comes to this Second World War period, there is always this slight possibility they could ask you a question simply about 1930, 1951, for example. I think it's really unlikely for it to be something really specific about this. What I think is more likely is they might extend the question. Instead of going from, say, 1918 to 39, it might go to 45, for example, something along those lines. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of run through this one fairly quickly. There's an argument that some of the changes that are brought about as a result of the war help to narrow or shrink the gap in standards of living amongst the majority of the population, basically, and kind of brings people together. Again, this links into that topic about class, this argument of how far there's a levelling of the class divide in the interwar period, or sorry, between 18 to 51. There is an argument that the Second World War is a big leveller of the class divide, in particular when it comes to living standards, and that's largely enabled as a result of rationing. Rationing is imposed upon the country fairly equally. People basically rationing applies to everyone in the country. And so people have the same limited access to food and resources regardless of their wealth. And rationing pretty much affects most areas of spending. And so what happens is, the way the rationing system works on a basic level is you get given a ration card, and it basically allocates how much of each particular kind of food stuff you can purchase, things like, so your meat, your dairy, even luxuries like coffee, etc. Other essentials like clothes get rationed, and so as a result, no matter how rich you are and how much you can afford, once you've met your rationing quota, basically you can't go over that amount. And again, it extends to kind of other ranges of kind of resources or essential items people require. You even, at the beginning of the Second World War, get loopholes for people to exploit rationing. So, for example, restaurants are sometimes a way for people to kind of circumvent this system. However, even these loopholes get halted by about 1942 when they're no longer able to. Basically, rationing also gets applied to purchasing from restaurants as well, I think. So it basically helps to level the class divide, and you can argue that's a way in which living standards, I suppose, become closer together. Specifically though, there's also this argument that rationing does actively help to improve the standard of living for various people, in particular when it comes to their health and diets, even if their personal living standard declined. Part of the reason is because during the rationing period as well, the government basically introduces price controls that reduce the cost of various essential goods, and that makes a wider range of goods more affordable for poorer families who previously would have struggled with them. The second thing is the government also supplements food with various minerals and vitamins, and kind of gives people advice about how to grow things or sort of health advice, etc. And so government control of these various institutions also helps to increase people's health on the whole. And that's enough of rationing. Final point as well, which I think, again, a more minor point. It would be very difficult to sustain a whole argument about it. There's also an argument that work conditions for the average worker also improved during the Second World War, and that's partly due to the fact that there is a greater demand for certain jobs in the way that there wasn't in the interwar period, in particular certain industries. And so there are actually, for the first time, more jobs required than there are workers to fill them. So the government basically has to incentivize people to take those jobs. Trade unions' bargaining power becomes strengthened as a result as well. A lot more so than it was before the war, which again, if you've done your trade unions revision recently, will know is quite weak. So you do get actually the average wage of workers increasing during the Second World War as a result of the need to convince people to take certain jobs. Having said that, even though wages are increasing, given that rationing is still in place, they are limited on what they can actually spend on. That's always a minor drawback. Okay, so the interwar period, so the post-war period is where there's a bit less debate over the extent to which living standards increase, and that's where I'd say this topic can potentially get a bit trickier. So I would say, if you've got a question about living standards in the interwar period, it is most likely going to be simply about the extent to which they increased or not. Because in the interwar period, it is much more debatable, and there is more of an argument to be had about how far living standards increase. You could also get a question about living standards increasing after the Second World War. However, as you'll see in a moment, the answer is they basically did. It's very difficult to argue they didn't, as we'll see in a moment. As a result, what that means is you could also just as likely get a question asking you why they increased, or specifically stating a factor for the reason why there were increased living standards, or they could even phrase about why there was a consumer society, etc. So it can get a little bit trickier as a result, but for the most part, it's still a good topic. So yeah, austerity basically is brought to an end in 1951. So austerity and rationing is brought to an end in 1951, and that kind of is seen as the onset of this kind of new consumer society in Britain. And so, as I said, they've often focused on why that came about. Okay, just before we go into the consumer society issue, I just want to spend a bit more time looking at housing again briefly, and I find it to be a massively dull subject. Yeah. Okay. So it has to be mentioned because although I mentioned there are some improvements in housing, in standard of living when it comes to housing before the Second World War, generally speaking, the situation wasn't brilliant. Additionally, the Second World War and the destruction of it with it, and the jet bombing campaigns, the Blitz, etc., it also made the situation worse. There was a greater or wider amount, there was much more widespread squalor, and conditions were worse as a result. So in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when it comes to standards of living, one of the really big contentious issues is this issue of housing for a couple of reasons. First of all, there was this problem where, as I mentioned already, after the First World War ended, you had a large number of sort of ex-soldiers coming back home and not having sort of homes to live in, being sort of beggars living on the street. There was this kind of real determination to make sure that that never happened again, and kind of make sure that there were these homes fit for heroes as a result. And so housing did become a really major sticking point when it came to sort of election campaigns, etc. Even I think in 1951, when the Conservatives finally retook power from Labour, one of their really major campaign promises was, we're going to build 200,000 homes, I think, per year or something like that. So it was still, up until the beginning of the 50s, quite a big issue, building more houses because it was necessary. Okay, so there's a major issue as a result. We can generally say that the issue of squalor after the Second World War was largely dealt with successfully, and that living standards as a result did improve somewhat, we say significantly. And this was done primarily in two ways. First of all, through the creation of, these prefabricated homes or prefabs, and then secondly, by building more sort of tower blocks or blocks of flats, which nowadays look hideous, but at the time were quite a good solution to the housing situation in the country. First of all, prefabs, I'm just beginning with that, were a pretty successful solution, essentially because they were quite they're quite fast and cheap to assemble. Basically, they're meant to be temporary housing. You get a lot of prefabs in America. Again, they don't look particularly nice, these prefabricated houses. Basically, you get all the different pieces for the house to be built with. You put them all together and then you assemble them on the spot, basically. So as a result, they're quite fast and cheap to assemble. And the homes themselves, despite that, were actually of quite a good quality. So they were originally designed to last for only 10 years. A lot of those original prefabs are still standing right now. So in terms of the quality of the housing, it was of a pretty decent quality. And so the owners themselves were usually quite highly satisfied with those houses and those experiences. And when they eventually had to leave, were often quite sad and willing to do so. Tower blocks as well also help to alleviate this issue, primarily because of the fact that you're able to build with land quite a lot more efficiently as a result. So the sort of prefab situation in tower blocks helped improve the housing situation after the war, in the immediate aftermath, that is. Additionally, you start to see a lot of these new towns cropping up and being created after the Second World War. So a variety of new towns are created, your sort of Milton Keynes type locations. Sort of pop up to basically provide new housing for people. These new towns are often sort of criticised or seen to have been quite artificial and lifeless as a result. Having said that, despite that, the towns themselves were actually quite good places to live, and people who moved there were quite highly attracted to a lot of the conveniences you had. So, for example, because they were all newer houses, you tended to have in these places access to things like hot water, central heating, which again in the post-war period is still a rarity in most houses. You have garden spaces, access to shops and amenities that are kind of built up around them. So they're towns that have been planned in a particularly intelligent way, and sort of have quite a few conveniences about them. So again, it's quite popular housing. Finally, when it comes to this housing situation, and again, building new towns, this building of new towns also helps to alleviate and relieve the overcrowding of a lot of working class slums. So in this era, in this time period, you basically get the New Towns Act, leading to the creation of about 14 towns on the outskirts of the major cities, these sort of like satellite towns. So these are sort of places like Telford, Stevenage, etc. Previously, what you've got is you've got massive overcrowding of working class in slums in the major cities like London and Birmingham. And so these new towns are basically created in the outskirts of these major towns, and sort of reduce the massive overcrowding in them. In addition to the homelessness that was caused by the wartime bombing. And so for the first time, you get working class families moving to these estates in suburbs as opposed to having previously lived in these very crowded slums in the inner city. Okay, so that leaves housing aside. So the rest of this topic then focuses on living standards and their impact after sort of 1951, so this issue of consumer society. So you could specifically get questions that ask you about living standards from 51 onwards, in which case housing becomes less important and is really more focused on consumer spending and things like that. Or it could specifically ask about consumer society, which is more restricted. The 50s is basically when this really takes off. So you get 1950s, a significant increase in consumer spending on various labour-saving devices, which I've already mentioned start to kind of come about in the 30s, but it's not really so widespread. In the 50s, this is really when you start to see most people have access to a large number of inconveniences. So people are basically buying things like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, fridges, etc. And so ownership of these items soars significantly in the 50s and the 60s. So for example, the number of homes that have washing machines in the 50s and 60s goes from 17% to 60% from 55 to 66. Again, if you wanted to bring in this issue of women when it comes to living standards, this is an area where that kind of links into it again. So this particularly helps improve the living standards of women whose lives become much easier as a result of these items being introduced. Tasks that would previously take a week of back-breaking labour can be reduced to a few hours of work, basically. So for most women, or for many women, this does result in an improved standard of living. That does have other issues that come along with it, which again, if you've looked at the women topic, we kind of delve a little bit more. Because the question is, if you've got a whole week to spend, what do you do with it? But that's a separate topic. Linked to this increased spending on labour-saving devices, you also, in general, like the interval period, get an improvement in the spending power of the average consumer. As I mentioned, working class families could now afford a greater range of labour-saving devices that also extended to a range of other consumer goods. The reasons why this happens, though, are largely due to the relaxation of rules surrounding consumer credit. So if you ever got a question about why there's a consumer society, you can always talk about this thing about consumer credit. So rules surrounding acquiring consumer credit is relaxed in 1954. As a result, people can basically start to buy products on hire purchase schemes. These are basically introduced after 54 onwards. The reason why this is quite important is because beforehand, people to basically lend money, you would essentially have to go to like Nicky the Greek, the local loan shark, who's basically going to threaten to like break your kneecaps if you don't pay the money back. So there's obviously quite a lot of social stigma surrounding the idea of moneylenders before this time period. So it's just not a thing you do before that because it's got a range of risks associated with it, and obviously kind of the types of people who sort of like take loans out, it has certain social stigma attached to it. After 54, this relaxation of consumer credit, it makes it less risky in the first place. In addition, as a result, there's not as much stigma surrounding the idea of it. And so people are willing to entertain the thought for the first time. And so as a result, in addition to things like labour-saving devices, you for the first time get people purchasing in large numbers items like television sets, for example. In addition to purchasing consumer products, and also again, this can link to the idea of this can either be a point about living standards increasing or also why it happens. There's also a greater availability of luxury goods and wider consumer choices. So there's a much wider range of consumer goods that are basically being advertised to people and kind of pushed on them. And so people are basically beginning to demand as essential items that really would have amazed previous generations. So things that people never thought about spending money on, people are increasingly beginning to demand as essential items. This is something which we can argue is largely driven by advertising. If you want an alternative argument to say, for example, the credit argument. So a primary example of an item which would never have been considered essential, but in the post-war period becomes essential, are personal hygiene products and products related to appearance. Again, it's really hard to imagine, but like 70, 80 years ago, people basically would not have thought about buying like deodorants, or would have considered like personal sort of body odor to a particular issue. Certain products that have quite big advertising campaigns linked to them shift people's perceptions of certain items. So the prime example of this is Old Spice, which is this original sort of male deodorant brand. And it really, kind of part of the advertising campaign is to really push the idea that it's a male brand. It's not a feminine thing to basically wear kind of perfume or something which kind of improves your odor. Prior to this, it would be basically primarily a female thing to do. So again, you've got products like Old Spice have really big advertising campaigns behind them and kind of lead a shift in people's perception of these items. Yeah.
Was it quite expensive? Or?
No, they're not particularly expensive. These are things that are largely affordable. I mean, it's deodorant. Deodorant could be expensive. And so yeah, by 1969, you have over half all men and women using either scented deodorant, a perfume, or aftershave. And so this is your prime example of an item, which is now considered an essential, sort of like they're considered essential toiletries. You go back to the 30s, people thought it was amazing, but in this time period, this really becomes a kind of a must-have item. In addition to issues like, in addition to things like toiletries, you also get new fashions becoming quite prevalent. In particular, you start to get the development of a lot of cheap clothes that are based around, basically based around the kind of designs of more expensive pioneering fashions. So again, if you think about things nowadays, it's not kind of a strange idea. Most fashion looks the same, whether it's sort of your cheap clothes at the rack in a budget store or something from like a really fancy designer. They all have very similar looks. Again, this is something which kind of begins for the first time in the kind of 50s, 60s, where people will take sort of expensive pioneering designs of major fashion labels and mass produce them in a very similar way for much cheaper prices.
Is this like the 1960s?
Yeah, the 1960s in particular. And so this is particularly important for women who are increasingly able to access certain kinds of fashion. So again, it's something which seems quite odd now, but it's really in the 60s onwards where for the first time, if you looked at a woman's clothes, it wouldn't really be an indicator of her class background, whereas before that it would have been, because their clothes would look quite different. From the 60s onwards, you start to get, for example, companies like Bieber, I don't know how it's pronounced, I've never heard of this thing before, to be honest, people have apparently, mass producing sort of the designs that they basically find in like these really posh boutiques like Mary Quant boutiques in the West End. Again, you could, if you wanted to develop an argument about why this takes place, you can once again link it to newspapers and advertising, where you get, for the first time in this period, newspapers really pushing a lot of these looks that are kind of coming out, people increasingly desiring to have those looks, so companies cater for it. Final point then, when it comes to consumer society, and again, all reasons why living standards increase, is the greater choice of and cheaper availability, cheaper cost of food. So from 1950 onwards, you start to get the growth of major supermarkets. So the first Sainsbury's is built or was opened in 1950, and these supermarkets lead to a wider choice of food and cheaper costs of those food. Part of the reason behind that is because supermarkets are able to slash their prices in size and undercut local shops. There's also the end of something called the retail price maintenance, which is a system, a government system, which is basically designed to control prices to keep them over a certain amount. That comes to an end, and so it allows these large supermarkets to start slashing their costs aggressively, and in particular undercut local shops. And so these small-scale grocer and sort of producers on sort of like local areas lose out significantly as a result. However, the average consumer gains quite a lot from this change. A, because things are cheaper. B, because their quality and convenience is also significantly better as well. So again, it's another way in which people's quality of life increases. So you could either mention it in an essay about that, or discuss a reason why that's the case. Yeah.
Were supermarkets mainly in the city, or were they in rural places as well?
first of all, about rural. I'll mention it when I do the 4C topic, the tourism thing, the tourism and transport. You do have some in the cities, but then when you also get start cropping up because people now have access to cars, you start to get these supermarkets building really big supermarkets outside of on the outskirts of the cities. So it's a range. Basically, I wouldn't say rural, but they're not necessarily inner city areas. Okay, so as you can see, it's a pretty strong and solid argument to make that living standards do on the whole increase. If by some chance you were to get a question asking you about how far they did increase, then you do obviously have to make counter-arguments to suggest that they didn't, at least one argument. And so you can still make the argument that actually this mass consumerism, or this kind of really big consumer society, actually hid the lives of millions of people who actually remained deprived in this period. Not everyone advised, not everyone did law basically. So one big thing is obviously homelessness. Homelessness remained, despite the improvement in living housing conditions, a significant problem, with tens of thousands of people remaining homeless. Additionally, some of those new homes we mentioned, for example, high-rise flats and blocks, the quality of housing then was basically variable. A lot of people weren't too keen on living there in the first place. They had rather different community feels and atmospheres about them. And you had sort of other general issues with their maintenance or the kind of amenities available in those. So, for example, parts of Manchester in 1963, for example, tens of thousands of no, sorry, wrong one. Not Manchester, sorry. A lot of these homes, for example, tended to have issues with, for example, cold and damp. That's the first thing. The second thing is the actual quality of those buildings in the first place weren't always of the highest standard, particularly when it comes to safety regulations. So some of the homes that were built quite poorly, the really famous example of this is in '68. There's the Ronan Point flats in London. There's a big explosion, basically killed quite a few people, and it was basically due to gas leaks caused by defects in the build. If I'm not mistaken, those defects were, in some instances, the walls, instead of having actual materials inside them, were being stuffed with newspapers, which obviously you can imagine wasn't the safest way to build them. So there were sort of like corners cut when these places were built. They weren't always of the best quality. As I mentioned, there were also issues of crime in some of these tower blocks, which obviously have kind of carried on until today. As types of housing, they are more likely to lend themselves to issues of crime, sort of criminal networks, and being more difficult to sort of disperse. Finally, then, with the same issue of deprivation or people remaining deprived, you also still get millions of people in the 60s, into the late 60s, still living beneath the poverty line. This is particularly the case for the elderly. So you get really quite a lot of vulnerable older people living in quite run-down areas. And the numbers specifically, I'll finish up on this, so you've still got about 1.5 million people, older people, living basically alone on small pensions in quite dirty conditions in not very great housing. And so when you focus on this sort of young, exciting, swinging 60s cultural trend or whatever, you don't, when you think of the 60s, you don't really think of the sort of soft underbelly of quite deprived older people who aren't really involved in that and actually continue to live quite a deprived life and existence. So if you get a question about living standards, you would only, about whether they increased or not, you would only really need to make one counter-argument. So you could make one big argument about how some people remain deprived despite that. And this is some other points you could also mention from different sub-themes. So this is definitely a topic where the counter-arguments would maybe need to come from other sub-themes potentially if you want to develop them. Otherwise, yeah, for the most part, I think this is definitely a candidate for a question about why there's an increased living standard. There are other points that can be mentioned from other sub-themes or from the other sub-themes in this topic, which I'll basically come to, but I'll leave that topic there as it is. That's all right.
Like and subscribe, guys.
Just press
Just press the
same button.
yeah.